Recording in progress.
And then the field trip on Saturday, and then finals. So, how's everyone feeling? Everyone staying warm?
Yeah.
Not blown away by the wind yet? Do you have any questions regarding presentation for finals for December 1st? We're putting together the calendar right now. And I've given you some instructions in the past, in the last few weeks about length and such. But I'll let you know on the day of where your sequence is, as we haven't really figured it all out yet. But we will go from about 6:40 until 9 o'clock, because we're doing finals all in one evening. Yes. Yeah, so usually I've always framed the course or the presentation as you get 3 minutes when you speak to council to pitch to council. So the class has always been in a way just 3 minutes, but then students always go over because it's really hard to get your ideas across in 3 minutes. So I'm giving you kind of a 2-minute leeway there, so at least 5 minutes for your presentation, and then there's an extra 5 to 6 minutes where our reviewers, our director, and I got Dr. Warner coming, and also Winnie Serrano, who's our SME manager, coming. So yeah, so we'll give them at least another 5 minutes to review your presentation. So about 10 minutes per person, but really your presentation should really be about 3 to 5 minutes. How do you use the PowerPoint too? We haven't even, so what I've always had students do is put their PowerPoint onto the Google Drive. Okay, where you put your homework. I'll send more detailed instructions, but that's what we'll do. And then on the day of, then Ian will load them up and then have them ready. Further questions? Field trip, scavenger hunt. Final. I think tonight might be a short night. We have. I'll get started. We have one speaker who's a dear friend of mine who has been in this class many, many times over in different capacities. And I'm welcoming her back here tonight to talk about the Interstate Bridge project and its impact to the community and the huge equity component that's a part of this project in our region. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to my dear friend, Millicent Williams.
Thank you, Tui. Good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Millicent, and Tui's mentioned I've presented for her a number of times over the past several years, and she indicated in several different roles. The first time I presented, I was the Capital Programs Division Manager for the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So the entire capital program, I'm okay. All right, the entire capital program, which is, all of the streets, all of the bridges and structures that the city is responsible for managing, were a part of the portfolio of work that I had. We built our team up to about 25 project managers from 8 when I got there. With the goal of making sure that we were delivering according to the expectations that the community had for the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So after a couple of years of doing that, I was then promoted to deputy director, and I served in that capacity as soon as the pandemic hit. So that was fun. But what made it at least something that I could navigate well was that in a former life, I was the emergency manager for the District of Columbia. And so I was able to bring forward a lot of that emergency management, emergency response, coordination, and continued continuity of operations work to what I was doing for PBOT. So I was honored to serve in the role, but it was really challenging to serve in that space when, and as you probably heard, or if you haven't heard, as you'll learn, especially once Director Warner comes in a couple of weeks, the Bureau was hit pretty hard during the pandemic. Much of the revenue that it generates comes from parking. And when nobody's leaving their house and parking, there's no revenue. And fees. And so a lot of activities stopped completely. And so that was a really challenging time to navigate. And then you had 1,000 employees that needed to either continue their work from their remote location or show up every day to continue to do the work that needed to be done. So the maintenance operations portion of the organization is about 350 staff. They had to refigure out how to continue to get the work. And I believe Tara came, so deputy, she's now the deputy director. And she was over maintenance operations during the height of the pandemic. And so she might have spoken to that a bit, but I was there. And then 18 months ago, I left a really long stint in public life because I served in Texas and in DC prior to coming to Portland. And I said, I'll do like LeBron James and take my talents on the road. And I left public sector and started work for OTAK, which is a local, well, it's a locally based architectural and engineering firm with locations in Portland, of course, Southwest Washington. So we have a Vancouver office, we have an office in Puget Sound, and then we have offices in Colorado and in New Hampshire, and then we have an international presence as well. So that's been really interesting. I'm responsible for managing the public sector book of business, and the teams that I provide leadership to include transportation and infrastructure, water, natural resources, survey, bridges and structures, and construction management and inspection. And that is the largest group within the largest footprint within the company of any one group. So I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner, I am none of those things. But what I do bring is organizational management, organizational development, change management, and different perspectives. And that's what they needed. They didn't need another engineer to engineer the engineers. They needed someone who thought differently. And so I took the opportunity to expand my horizons and do something different. And that has been also challenging because I went in the middle of the pandemic and when no one was coming to work. And I didn't meet the majority of my staff until today at the potluck that we had. So, you know, it's been an interesting journey working in infrastructure for the past couple of years. But one of the things that happened once I got to OTAK, and it was kind of touching on bridge work as it was, the conversations were beginning prior to leaving PBOT. But one of the things that happened once I got to OTAK was there were a couple of problems that needed to be solved and some support that that team needed in bringing together the 10 key stakeholders that are helping to lead the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project forward. So for those of you who are not familiar, the IBR project or the Columbia River Crossing, which is what some people may refer to it as, even though nobody's calling it that anymore. Don't say that, don't say that. But the bridge that will cross over the Columbia, which will be the Interstate Bridge, is a project that needed some facilitation support. So what I do in that space is bring together the 10 key stakeholders, which includes the director of the Oregon Department of Transportation, Chris Strickler, Secretary of Washington Department of Transportation, Secretary Millar, Lynn Peterson, who's president of Metro Council, Matt Ransom, who is over the RTC, so that's in Southwest Washington, Sam Dessou, who is the general manager for TriNet, John Donahue, who is the CEO for C-Tran, the two ports and their leadership. So Curtis Robinhold from the Port of Portland and Juliana Marler from the Port of Vancouver. And then the elected officials, Commissioner Joanne Harsty, who is the Commissioner for Transportation, and Mayor Ann McInerney Ogle, who is the Mayor of Vancouver. And then there were CAG members, Community Advisory Group members, who would also participate in this collection of leaders to help to make decisions about the bridge. So I joined the team in October of last year with some pretty aggressive mandates about what needed to happen within a very short period of time. And long story short, we need to get everybody on the same page and moving in a direction that would cause the project to move forward. So we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight, some of the steps that were taken and some of the ways that we're engaging the community to make sure that we're getting the voices of everyone that needs to and wants to have an opportunity to influence the decisions that are being made on the bridge. So the current bridge, this one that I'm sure you crossed, or that you have attempted to cross, it's like traffic and try to find something else to do, is just over 100 years old, and it is held up by wooden piles bottom of the roof. So at any given time, it can just go. And I'm exaggerating maybe a little bit, but not too much. So the fact of the matter is it has reached its useful life and it does need to be replaced. And one of the first things that when I had the opportunity to begin to engage partners, I asked was, who wants a new bridge? And everyone said, I want a new bridge. So I felt like that's pretty easy. If everybody wants it, this shouldn't be hard to get to a solution. Now, everybody wants it the way they want it, and that's where the issue comes in. Everybody wants it to look the way they want it to look. Everybody wants it to be the width that they want it to be. Everybody wants it to be the height that they want it to be, not high. They want for it to land in certain places and feed into or out of certain places. And so that's where the rub comes in. That's where the negotiation happens in getting everyone on the same page about all of those pages within that book. So yes, everybody wants a bridge. How do we get to the bridge? Many, many different ways. So I'm going to share with you a presentation that was made to the Community Advisory Group last week, because I don't know what day it is. Yes, last week. I am not facilitating Community Advisory Group conversations. There is a separate set of team members who are doing that. But as we're sharing information in any setting, we need to make sure that we're using a set of standard slides, set of standard information. I don't make my own individual presentations because it's very important that the messages and that the information is consistent as it is shared. So you'll see perhaps someone else's name at the beginning of a slide. Ignore that. I did ask permission to use these slides. And it is important that we're sharing the same information because, as we know, if we put something out there and I make an iteration or I iterate the slide in a certain way to make it more palatable, I could change the meaning of it. So we don't want to do that. So this was last week, and you can find everything that I'm talking about on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Bridge website or program website. It's IBR, interstatebridgereplacement.org, I believe. I think it's at the end. I'll double check. But you can find everything to include this presentation and the full meeting if you go to those to that website and or to our YouTube page. So anyway, I'm skipping through all of this. This is what we have to go through as we're preparing to have public meetings. You have to read all of these slides because you want to make sure that you're addressing the needs of all of the folks who may be listening or reading who may not be able to see. So there's instruction that we have to give. So the program administrator gave an update, and I'm just going to run through the slides really quickly. Thank you. The first thing that they talked about in the CAG meeting, and this is what we were trying to get the group to move toward, was the agreement on a modified locally preferred alternative. That's what an LPA is. It's a locally preferred alternative, and we had to get all 10 partners to agree that they wanted what we were proposing as a program. So in July of this year, all of the partners came together and unanimously agreed to advance the program with a number of conditions that they put in place. 175 in fact conditions, and I'll go over what some of the elements of the LPA are, but there were conditions that were placed by each of these by each of the entities that are a part of the collection of community leaders. But these were the key elements, the 10 elements that we agreed to address, but also include in the locally preferred alternatives. So there is specific language about auxiliary lanes, which for those of you who may have been following the I-5 project, know that that is a part of what makes that project, Rose Quarter project, controversial, is the number of lanes and what an auxiliary lane is, and does that actually increase the width of the road, and does that actually increase throughput. So that was one of the decisions. The LPA suggests that there will be one auxiliary lane in either direction. The LPA also talked about community and partner engagement. And so there are expectations about the number of ways and times that the program will be engaging community and ensuring that we're hearing those voices and reflecting back what we hear. There are specific things that they want to make sure that they see in the design. Of course, the program has to address equity. Any transportation project that you will encounter in most communities, not all, most communities, many communities, especially where there has been significant harm done to the community because of the transportation infrastructure that was put in place, will address equity, or need to address equity, and ensuring that we're not doing things that are unduly harmful to certain parts of the community, and that we're forgetting the voices of those who have been previously hurt or harmed by the programs that were put in place, and that the benefits out of the program, out of any construction project, are actually shared equally as well. So we can talk about that a little bit. We talked about how much the bridge will cost, what those limits will be. There is certainly very specific language about how the program wants to make sure it's addressing climate. The NEPA process, which we will talk about, it's the, don't make me tell you what the acronym stands for right now, but I'll tell you in a minute. And then traffic patterns, not just crossing the bridge, but in the communities that are affected by the bridge on either side of the bridge. Transit, the option for transit, in terms of making sure that there is light rail that goes over the river and along the width or along the stretch of the bridge, and then tolling. There will, at least today, be tolling on the bridge, and there will be variable rate tolling. What that means is that depending on any number of factors, whoever crosses the bridge will pay a toll based on whatever those factors are. So there are concerns about the equity in tolling. So that's something that we will be discussing briefly in this presentation, or the inequities that are related to tolling. For those of you who've lived in spaces where there are toll roads, I moved here from Dallas, Texas, and if I wanted to get anywhere at all, I use the toll road. And you don't have to have a toll tag to ride the toll road, but if you don't, and if you do, if you ride the toll road, it gets pretty expensive, pretty quick. But you got to get to work, or you got to get to wherever you got to go, and you use it, and it adds up and adds up and adds up, and then you're like, okay, so it's time for me to go and redo my registration. Oh, I had $500 worth of toll fees that I didn't know I had, or I didn't think would affect my registration. So now I can't, it's a lot. It's a lot that goes into it. So that's the big area of contention for the program that we're talking about. But many of the things that the partners are talking about that are concerns for them are built into the program. So the program is pretty early in its design. And even in the conversations, it's probably going to be a 10-year long project from true start to finish. And so there are a lot of things that will be included in the design because of the nature of the work. But the partners wanted to make sure, so they put it in their conditions. And when we say the conversations have been ongoing, literally just before I came here, was on a call with 3 different people from the city of Portland to talk about potential opportunities for different things to be happening with the program, to hear their thoughts, concerns, and then I'll be talking to those same people again tomorrow morning at 7:30 to make sure that everybody's on the same page with people who other people were talking to about the same thing from the other jurisdictions. So it's just so much fun. Anyway, we're gonna breeze on through. So we talked about the locally preferred alternative, and this is visually what the locally preferred alternative looks like. There is a partial interchange at Hayden Island. I'm assuming you all know where Hayden Island is. If you don't, it's where Target is off of I-5. That's Hayden Island. If you know that, because you know you can't get there if you try to get off on Lombard and come across.
Is that part of Oregon or Washington?
It's part of Oregon. Yeah, so it's the northernmost part of Oregon, just before you get to the bridge. So Hayden Island. And then there is, as I mentioned, transit. So light rail to what they're calling the Evergreen Station. It's not really a station yet, but the Evergreen location. So the agreement is that transit will not extend beyond that terminus, is what they call it. That was an important point of interest. I don't want to say contention, a point of interest, especially for our Southwest Washington partners who, you know, in large part are in agreement with having transit come across the river. But there are many who are not supportive of it for any number of reasons. And it's interesting when we hear some of the reasons why people say they don't want transit, it's because they suggest that they don't want in Southwest Washington what Portland has. And I'm like, well, I am unclear as to what negative things people see as it relates to transit in Portland. Now, I know that there is homelessness in Portland, but if you look at the transit stations, that's not where tents are. That's not where homeless people are camping. If you look at who rides transit, you don't see them with glass shards on their jackets from breaking the window and going and getting a TV out of someone's living room and then taking it back on transit, because that's an actual illustration that someone offered. That people are going to break in our houses, steal our things, and get back on the train and take it. And if you've ever ridden any train in Portland, you can run faster than they go, depending on where you are. But that's here to there. You know, you might be able to tell I like subways. But so anyway, there, as I mentioned, are going to be auxiliary lanes on one in either direction for sure as a part of the local preferred alternative. What that means is it's not a full lane that would be the full length or width of the bridge, and that may end up being 2 or 3 lanes with the auxiliary lane, which is intended just for you to get on and get off. It's not going to be the full span of the bridge. There are points at which you'll be able to get on and off, but it eases that flow. So if you're coming off of Hayden Island, if you're coming from Target, until I go there a lot. If you're coming from, who doesn't? If you're coming from Target and you go around and you're trying to get up onto I-5 to go into Vancouver, the distance that you have to get into the flow of traffic is actually shorter than it should be. And so you have to stop, you have to wait, hope somebody lets you in. And that's what backs stuff up. That's what backs it. And for those of you who do not know, that area between the bridge and the Rose Quarter, we're considered to be the singular stop sign on I-5 from Canada all the way down to Mexico. So it's pretty broken. It's pretty broken. And so if you don't have to get into the flow of traffic to then get off of the flow of traffic, that can allow for that interstate travel to happen with relative ease. Now, the question is, how many people are traveling that stretch as an interstate and how many are using it as commuters? And so that's a question that is asked, especially as you talk about transit use and especially as you talk about climate, because there are concerns about both of those as relates to vehicle miles traveled that are going through that part of the corridor. That's a question I ask all the time, because if the majority of the people who are using it as an interstate, that changes the way that that roadway, that stretch of roadway needs to operate. If people are using it as commuters, then certainly we want to make sure that there's plenty of active transportation options. We want to make sure that there's plenty of transit options. We want to make sure that we aren't using too much roadway to accommodate for commuters if we don't need to. But that's a constant battle. If you do come into Portland from Vancouver on I-5, you'll notice that there are a whole lot of lanes coming from Southwest Washington, narrowing down to the bridge, versus when you're leaving Portland, going into Southwest Washington into Vancouver, there are only the 3 with the HOV lane, if you get to use it depending on the time of day. So they're proposing the 4 stations that are within a walk shed of the bridge influence area, and the breakdown of the population is 26% BIPOC and 41% low income. Again, that's why transit is important, and that's why looking at variable rate tolling is important. We're wanting to make sure that from end to end, the access to jobs is not just something that can happen, but that it's equitable, and that there is the ability for transit to be a real option for people. So depending on where you live, even in Portland, it may not be an option for you to use transit because it's faster to drive, or you think it's faster to drive, or parking is expensive. And so, or the same as riding transit. Well, not here, because you don't have to park, you don't have to pay for a park and ride here. In other places, you pay for park and ride, and then you pay for your transit ride. So you end up paying about $10, $15 a day just to ride transit. Often faster, but not necessarily. So those are things that are important. Again, we talked about climate, wanting to make sure that we're reducing the carbon footprint, and thinking about how much power is going to be needed to operate this well. Also considering the fact that by the 2035, the state of Washington is requiring that no more fuel-powered vehicles be sold in the state of Washington. So, and California's doing the same thing. So you know what that means. Oregon's next. And then looking at demand management to make sure that we're looking at how we can combat climate change. Wanting to make sure that we're increasing the efficiencies that are related to movement of people through that corridor, causing people to feel comfortable with moving out of their cars into something as an alternative. I don't know if anybody's ever ridden their bike along across that bridge. I wouldn't do it. So it's super scary. And then just wanting to make sure that we're thinking about emissions, even as we're talking about construction, because it's going to be a very long construction period. So all of those things are important considerations. I talked about the LPA, and now we will move into NEPA, which that's what that stands for, National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. So it's a series of studies of different factors within the programs of 20 or so that they're going to be looking at. And once all of that study is done, analysis is done, financial work is done, then the statement will come out. So the draft statement is scheduled right now for this summer. And then there's a whole year that we will have the opportunity to review again all of the items that are identified in the supplemental draft. And then we move to a record of decision in summer 2024. Now, that's important that we keep that schedule because the hope is that we would be able to move into construction by 2026. Now, if any of you know anything about building a project, especially in Oregon, that's not going to be easy to do because it takes a long time to get sidewalk infill projects done. Ask me how I know. So we know that that is an aggressive schedule, and we're not suggesting that the actual bridge span will be able to be constructed at that point. But the hope is that at least some packages can start in 2026 with the full bridge span and everything probably being finished by 2032, 2032, something like that. So for those of you who are familiar with Marine Drive, it's currently, this is not the best image in the world, but it's intentional because we don't want to place too much specificity because it will suggest that we know things about the design that we don't necessarily know, and we don't want to scare people. But the hope is that for the movement of vehicles as well as for trucks, that we're creating a smooth network. It's a heavy truck industrial port area. We need to make sure that that movement happens. If you've ever been out that way at 3 or after, between 3 and 6, trucks are just stacked up. They cannot move. And so we want to make sure that there's the opportunity for them to move. And then we also want to make sure that there are really clear connections for active transportation, bikes, walking, however, whatever alternatives, and then transit. Want to make sure that the local street connections are well established as well. There's essentially, if you look at it, it's really potentially 4 bridges. 2 to get you from the very northernmost part of Portland, where before you get to Hayden Island, so there's a little span, and then there's the larger span, which is across the full river. But they're still only calling it two bridges. The suggestion is that there will be 2 separate ones, not just one big wide thing. But so you see that here, the lanes reduce into the 2 bridges crossing. The current bridge, yeah, so this is Hayden Island, this is going into Vancouver. It will be separated, but here you see that there are 4 bridges, 2 more bridges. Sorry, wrong direction. There does have to also be an alignment for transit. Again, I mentioned the terminus at Evergreen, and then we have to think about park and ride. This is something I said in the very first class that I had the opportunity to teach. In this region, we don't pay for enough. And so we don't have, in some instances, the best facilities. In other places, people pay for their park and rides. Park and ride here is free. In other places, people pay a lot more for fees, and they have sales tax that goes to support infrastructure. Here, we don't do that. And so if you have potholy roads, find somebody to run for office that's gonna demand that you pay taxes, because that's what pays for roads. And it's not your property taxes. About 2% of your property taxes go to pay for infrastructure improvements. And infrastructure is not just roads, it's also what's under the roads. So the sewer systems and all of that. So remember that. If you ever get anybody that decides to run for office and says, we're gonna have taxes, you might get some new roads. So anyway, but since we don't pay for things, it makes it hard to operate the system as optimally as we might otherwise operate it. So we have to be very mindful about the impacts of things like a park and ride in terms of its size, the number of spaces, who will be able to access it, all of that. And then, of course, Southwest Washington has C-Tran, and we want to make sure that there is linkage to that system of transit. They're happy to be supportive, but they have their own system that they need to run, and essentially TriMet will be coming into an area that they've not been in before. We do know that C-Tran buses come here. TriMet buses don't go over there. So then there's going to be studies for, bless you, the downtown area of Vancouver, figuring out how to make sure that, especially with all of the work that's happening to improve that waterfront, that there's not harm done to the development, and actually that the bridge isn't unattractive, and that it doesn't cut off the skyline, and that you can see the sun, and that it's not just giant piles that you can't see down the river. That all of those things are very, very important. And what we don't want to see is these intestinal loops that come down from a really high bridge, but rather, especially as we're talking about active transportation, people walking and biking, but rather something that people can not have to go up too high over the river and come down in a way that is comfortable and functional. Sure, I'm running over. And then as you go down further into Vancouver, one of the areas that they're wanting to make sure that we're studying is the Fourth Plain and Mill Plain areas. That's where the Port of Vancouver sends most of its traffic. And so we want to make sure that that functions well. So there may be some improvements that go all the way down that far. Again, active transportation as well. So these are the alternatives that are going to be studied. Again, we can make these slides available to you, or you can go onto the website and get them. But there's a lot of analysis that goes into it. So for as small of an area as we have that we're working with, there are about 400 people that are working on the bridge right now. There's no construction, nothing, not even fully in design yet. So it's about 400 people now. And a lot of those people are devoted to doing this environmental work. What you've seen is concept. It is not the final thing. It's just to give people an idea of what we might be able to see as we're moving things forward. So there are chapters within the NEPA and the SDEIS analysis. There are 6 of them. That is standard for any NEPA process, any SDEIS. And then we get to the final decision, hopefully by 2024. And then we move on to start building really designing in earnest the bridge, although design has already begun. Any questions there? Because I'm gonna keep going. All right. So Tui talked about there being a community benefits agreement. And that's something that's really important for the program. Again, many transportation projects have across the country historically done significant damage to communities, have displaced communities in ways that are actually alarming. And Portland is high on the list of communities that has been guilty of doing just that. And so what we're trying to make sure that we do is not just build a project that serves the folks who are going to use the facility well, but that serves the community well. And so the hope and goal is to ensure that we are engaging contractors who are going to be able to be wealth builders through this process. As you can imagine, there are any number of consulting firms that are working on this. I'm a sub to a sub to a sub as I work on this. So really only a sub, but you get my point. There are a lot of subs. And I actually am working on 2 separate contracts. So I work on facilitation under one contract, and I work on community benefits under a different contract. My firm works on both. So, but we're wanting to make sure that firms are ready for the work. And so a lot of the work that's happening now with the I-5 Rose Quarter in terms of preparing minority, DBE, LSDBE, however you classify DB, V, veteran, woman, minority, disadvantaged, depending on how you're looking at it, whether it's from through a federal lens, a state lens, there are different things. COVID is the Oregon term that's used. we're wanting to make sure that they're ready. Additionally, we're wanting to make sure that the folks who are working on the project are hiring people from within the zip codes that are most affected. So that will help to keep that wealth within the community, give people living wages, all of that. So that's something that we're working on. That work in earnest is starting now. We anticipate by January, we'll have a task force or a community group that's going to be helping to inform how that moves forward. But all of these things are a part of what will make this project stand out. Very few projects of this scale and scope are talking about community benefits in the way that we are, that they're not centering equity in the way that we are. And so we hope that we can be a role model for others who are doing this type of work across the country. And we know that there's going to be a lot of work that's happening because of the infrastructure money that's coming out and being distributed across communities all over the country. And then the community benefit agreement will look at what has happened. So you may be familiar with Vanport. The bridge goes through the Vanport area, the historic Vanport area. So we have to talk about that. And then the other set of stakeholders that I did not mention, and it was not an intentional oversight, they're just not on any of the key committees that meet on a regular basis with me that I facilitate, but we do have constant conversation, communication, and coordination with our tribal partners and tribal leaders, tribal governments. There is a lot of anticipated need to either mitigate or reevaluate what we do based on what we may find when we start excavating. So if you've ever had to do an excavation and done historical work or site cleanup, there are a lot of artifacts that are here along the Willamette and the Columbia Rivers. And the ways that the tribes want to handle those things may not conform with the design and the ideas that we may have for the bridge. And it could take us back to a drawing board that could extend the project by not just months, but years. Certain findings we have had, and this is in my work at PBOT specifically, we have had tribes come do the evaluation and tell us to not disturb what was there. They would rather us pour concrete over it and leave it in the ground because that's where it was. We do not want us to move it, and we do not want it in a museum. So that is very important to know as we move through this space and understanding that what we as Americans, Western thinkers think about progress is not how everyone thinks. And so we have to be mindful of that. So we talked about the equity elements. These are the key areas. We want to make sure we're not doing further harm. We're wanting to include people in the decision-making process. We're looking at the community benefits. And we're also looking at community workforce agreements. So firms like mine, OTAK, what the program is going to want to see happen is that firms like mine should be also recruiting to ensure that people who are working at the firm are benefiting from the program as well, and that those folks are from those zip codes. So it's not just the minority firms that, or the DBE firms that should be hiring from community, but firms like mine and firms like WSP, which is the lead firm, should also be hiring from the community. I will tell you the demographic for my firm, Director Warner, when I told him what it was, he was like, well, that's a rounding error. It's 1.68% Black. That's great. So now, to be fair, Portland is 2.9% Black. I mean, Oregon is 2.9, Portland is 5.9. Still not great though. Still no excuse. I can go all day and not see anyone that looks like me. Shouldn't say I'm okay. I am okay. I functioned in these spaces all the time, but that is a thing that is challenging when your workforce does not reflect the community that it's seeking to serve. Because the voices that even come into the rooms that are responsible for planning and designing are muted if they're not there. So we have to be very intentional and require it. And you can require it. So that's what's happening. So I'm not gonna tell you about those meetings. I'm not gonna tell you about public comment. I do want to find, oh, I showed you some of the images. There are a couple of images that show some concepts, and maybe we can pull them up. I have to email them to you, but it's a general concept of what the bridge could look like. It's not in this presentation, obviously, but it is, it gives you a sense as to how it would operate. And it's cars on top, PEDs underneath on one side, and cars and trucks on top, and transit underneath or off to the side on the other side. So I'll try to find that and pull it up if I can get a signal or something, so I can show you. But so that's the bridge. Lots of conversations, lots of hard conversations. And it's as much a technical solution as it is a political solution. Interests are all over the board. Some of you may have heard of organizations like No More Freeways, who were very instrumental in helping reshape the conversation around I-5 Rose Quarter. Well, there's one that's specific to bridges, and it's Just Crossing Alliance. And so, you know, having those conversations, and with climate activists and others, trying to make sure that we're being thoughtful and intentional, and that we're, but that we're moving, because time is of the essence. We want to make sure that it's not just because it's old, not going to fall into the river, but that it withstands any potential seismic activity. And it's time. It's time. So that's the bridge, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that you may have. Well, sure. So they are close but separate. The Rose Quarter project is obviously much further along than this one, but it is not forgotten in every conversation that we have about the entire corridor. So the bridge influence area is about 5 miles in length, which includes the southernmost part of Southwest Washington, all the way down to, what's the bridge that goes over 405? That is 405. Selwood Bridge, sorry, it may be, that is the Fremont Bridge, but it's the Selwood Bridge that's included. So the Rose Quarter is a consideration in the planning. Now, the problem is that there are 2 different projects. And so at a point, they'll be competing for funding and other stuff. So, but some of the things that this project has learned from the Rose Quarter is what not to do, and what not to fail to address, and the importance of transparency, and really listening to what the community is saying, because the Rose Quarter could be much further along than it is. It took a couple of years to get itself righted because it insisted on being something other than it ended up being. But yeah, there are, the administrator is Greg Johnson, deputy administrator. One of them is an ODOT employee, actually. And so he is making sure that we're keeping our finger on that pulse as well. And that there are a number of the design leaders from ODOT. And so everybody is mindful of it, but if you fix one without fixing the other, you're not fixing the problem that I talked about in terms of that stop sign.
You talk about this the design is not ready and you're keep thinking about it, but I would like to know if you, because we're gonna build these in big in a structure, right?
Mhm.
But have you considered use this to get money? Like for example, use the infrastructure in the middle of the river,
Mhm.
which is very windy, and we have like the sun hitting there,
Mhm.
maybe to generate green energy, and maybe we can use that to pay some of the money or give it to the community at least.
I don't know about that. That's not a bad idea. That would probably be pretty expensive. But I do know that they're talking about electrifying the bridge so that electric cars can charge as they're crossing it.
I'm not talking about charge.
No, I know you're talking about
but
like wind
like
and
wind,
water.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's not
water
something
and
that-
sun,
yeah.
because three elements are there that it's a big infrastructure that cross
I'll take that back.
two, I mean, the state,
The
right?
bodies of water, yeah. Yeah, no, that's the body of water, the wind, and like I said, solar. So those are all viable options. That I will definitely take back to the
And
team.
if the states are changing this idea to replace cars that use gasoline for
Mhm.
green energies,
Mhm.
I think it would be nice.
No, that's not a,
to
that's a
bid on-
really
on
good
the
idea.
project.
That's a good idea. I am definitely going to challenge the team to think about that because they're designing. Yeah, it's at about 3% design. So there's plenty of opportunities. They haven't even thought about materials
Mhm.
and all of that. So yeah, that's really good.
I was curious about the light rail, and I'm not familiar with everything but stop. How is the light rail construction being crossing split between, Washington and Oregon?
So the finance strategy is still being worked out. To date, the contributors to the project have been the state of Washington, who committed $1 billion. Hopefully after the legislative session in January, Oregon will pony up its $1 billion. There have been grants that we applied for. One grant has been awarded. I have to look at the amount of that one, but it is, I have to look at it, but there are grants that we applied for. The Federal Transit Administration also has grants for programs such as this that we would be seeking to go after to get funding for the transit component. Neither TriMet nor C-Tran alone would be expected to necessarily pay for more of any of it than the other. In fact, the hope is that we'll be able to find alternative sources of funding to pay for the transit. That said, it would be TriMet's system, and so you could consider it something like the red line extension that was proposed that unfortunately did not pass. But the hope is that we would be able to limit the amount of bonding or other things and get money from some of those federal sources that are out there. The triggers for that will be making sure that we have progressed through the NEPA process and the SBAS process, identifying the ROD in a timely fashion. If we drag our feet on that, we miss a lot of windows. And so there are certain windows that are closing slowly, but once they're closed, they're closed. And so we have to be ready. That's something that we have to keep in the back of our minds since we're talking about all the other components that we gotta keep pushing. Otherwise, we're not going to be ready to apply for the funding. So getting to the LPA, the Local Preferred Alternative, by that July date was very important so that we could meet those two grant deadline dates that we submitted for the month after that. But those the ones are.
Yes. First of all, before I ask my question, let me just apologize for how amazingly inclusive and totally inspiring your process. sounds like you really just taking care of a lot of the stuff that traditionally gets in the way, so. And I hope that really helps clear the path so that this is all being explained to a lot of people. People are more accepting of local businesses. And so my question is really, at what point do you, like, when do you know you're ready to just go? Does this go to a vote? Does this go to?
So there, I talked about the 8, actually 10 stakeholders, but there are 4 entities on that group of that board, for lack of a better term. It's called the executive steering group. There are 4 entities that actually have the power to move this forward in cooperation with the bi-state legislative committee. And those 4 entities are Metro, the RTC, TriMet, and C-Tran. Everybody else is vote.
That's one.
You said it that. Their input helps to influence.
Yeah.
But they are the ones who are the ultimate deciders. And again, just as was the case with writing for funding, there are dates by when decisions need to be made so that a vote can be taken to a fix.
And if I can ask a really important question.
One is elected. One, two are hired, and I'm not sure about the RTC. May be appointed. But yeah.
Good luck to you.
Every day, need it every day. Any other questions?
When the, I guess the collective decision was made about we need to replace the bridge, who were the voices saying that the loudest? And was there anyone that says that replacing the bridge is too costly or not worth it or other priorities?
I think the voices were in use in terms of we need to replace the bridge. The areas of concern that he heard the loudest voices on were, this is to the Evergreen attorneys. So City of Vancouver is very concerned about how far into Vancouver we were going to be able to go with light rail. So that's a big issue. The voice of Metro and the City of Portland and the City of Vancouver about the number of auxiliary lanes was pretty loud as well. Initially, so their interest was in having one either direction, not 2. And so now the conversation is, can you use a shoulder as an auxiliary, which is actually what kind of happens now if you look at the 205 crossing. Which they don't currently use much because it's not very clean and I would imagine tires would get punctured off it, but me editorializing. Could you use a shoulder? And if you use a shoulder, would that then actually end up ultimately being a full lane? The problem is once you build it, you need to build it for as big as you need to build it for. And so maybe you can restrict use, but and I know that doesn't sound particularly conservative for me in terms of climate action, but you're not going to go back and build the bridge. You're not going to build a new lane on it, but you need to be thoughtful about the design because population is continuing to grow, especially in this area. And I don't anticipate that there will be any less people. There will be more. And even though there may be more cyclists, there are also more people. So it's not that any one mode is outpacing another. So I know that Portland is the bike capital of the US. It's still only 7% of the people who use their bikes to commute. And those people often still have cars. And even as the population continues to grow, it's still just 7%.
But it wouldn't change the number of lanes on the 5 south of the bridge, right? So then if there are more lanes on the bridge, but then it still constricts. So
Okay.
what's the point?
Well, that's a good question. But the bridge influence area does extend quite a ways down. So there is an opportunity to correct if it needs to. But right, the choke points though are these folks are coming on from Drive, these folks are coming in from Lombard, these folks are coming on from Haight Island. So some folks even say, well, just do a separate bridge to Haight Island, and let them take that bridge and over there. And, you know, that's not a real solution. It's a solution, but it's not a town. So it's a lot of work that has to be done to really get to the best solution. The challenge that we see often is the conversation between traffic engineers who focus on local and arterial streets and the traffic engineers who focus on highways, roadways, and state roads, who all have the same things in mind, which is safety and moving people safely. But the way that they think about that is very different. I will give you an example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the intersection of Columbia Road and Martin Luther King. One of those is a city road. One of those is operated by OTAK. And that intersection took 10 years to intersection, not stretch a road. Intersection took 10 years to settle because the roadway authority on one and the roadway authority on the other could not agree. And so that's going to be where the issue is, especially on those places where you have local streets that are feeding into, like again, Drive, Expo, all of those things. But some of those areas may be redeveloped as well. So, and that's a hope that will be a product of this project. We've already seen, if you do cross in that area, that Gross Hotel, it's come down. Is it the Red Lion? The Red Lion? That's not. So, with the hopes that on the Portland side, it would look something like the Vancouver side.
I have two questions. The first one is what's going to happen to the funds and looking at what's going to be visions for that. And the second one is in the community advisory group, like how because some of the people who are like comfortable in the spaces are.
Sure. So while the bridge is being built, the current bridge will remain. Once the new bridge is opened, the old bridge will be decommissioned and it will be taken down. It is possible that some of that material will be able to be used for other things, but they will have to do testing of all of it to ensure its viability to use it in other places. There may be some historic passes that we can use it on, some culverts, retaining walls, some other things that we may be able to use some of that. Piles would not be used. As it relates to the community advisory group, over 500 people applied to be a part of the community advisory group. I believe it was 25 or 30 people that were selected, and they do come from a pretty broad cross section of interested parties. Some of them are local activists, business owners. Others are interested residents who just want to see their thing being improved, not just. Others are not representative of another group and rather just want to see their neighborhoods do well. So as it relates to the forward-moving progress on any of those advisory groups, it's likely that there will be another opportunity for us to open the door for people to become involved. That will be announced. And certainly in other ways, I'm pretty sure this week, it's certain that after this class, we should perfect use, so I'm pretty sure she gets the information that there are opportunities. Because it is important to hear, of course, that this is that represent different backgrounds, interests, and passions, and desires. So. I don't think so. The commitment, the time commitment is, I don't want to say it's negligible. It's, right now, it's maybe 8 hours a month. But I feel like there are some community-based organizations that have received grant funds to ensure that information is being shared. The CAG members, and there are two committees, the advisory groups, community advisory group and the equity advisory group. So separate memberships altogether, but yeah, they.
So are the 4 major partners, are they co-hosting the advisory groups, or is there different kind of acting organizations?
The 4 organizations do not have anything to do at all with the advisory. They attend, but those groups are chaired. They have co-chairs for the CAG, and the equity advisory group has a singular facilitator. But the members of the organizations go to the meetings to hear, and occasionally to respond to the question that is germane to their entity, because the program in many instances cannot and will not answer questions that those entities should be answering. Yeah, they're advisory to the executive steering group. So does the executive steering group do everything that the CAG wants them to? Not necessarily, but they're advisory too. But they do not have a formal, and they are not. They're not advising on design. They're advising on community sentiment. Let me double check. Is it the Interstate Bridge down the road? Okay. Perfect. Okay. Yes.
You know, philosophically, if OTAK and WashDOT put so much money into national bicycle infrastructure and freeway infrastructure, it would need different outcomes for people who want to walk, bike, and transit. I think a large number of people in Portland kind of feel like those people who are trying to live a healthier lifestyle, walking, biking, taking transit, are being sort of marginalized a lot by another organization that just thinks cars are the only way to travel. It's, look at how Europe responded to the gas crisis in the 1970s, Groningen, Amsterdam, and all these places that really transformed the way they administer their cities. Higher gas taxes, requiring people closer in some ways. Those are places where people want to go. And people want to come to Portland because it's beautiful here. And it's sort of the how are we managing our future? But for a bridge that hasn't fallen down yet, and there's a little bit of congestion, a little bit of traffic congestion. It was sort of backwards, but so many years ago, Portland was transformed by denying the fairway project. It's an interesting argument to try to figure out if you want certain outcomes, you should invest in those outcomes. Measure what is important. If you want more people to ride bikes, walk, you need to build that infrastructure. More people drive, you build infrastructure. And that they won't take transit, so now you're gonna put the rail and you can't. So it's great that some of these things are happening. I think dancing around something that fiscally it's obvious. Budget from you, measure from you care.
Sure. I agree with your logic around investing in what you care about and seeing different outcomes based on the advantage you invest. I know that Portland prioritizes around that Metro supports that prioritization. The challenge that ODOT has, again, I kind of laughing about it, they care about the same things. They care about the same things. They do. The challenge that they have is that they are in Washington. They're responsible for managing Interstate. And so the goal is to move people from state to state now, whether they're moving them from Washington to California or Oregon to Idaho or Oregon to New York. You're doing that on an interstate. You're typically not doing that on a bikeway. So there does need to be the ability to balance how much of the investment goes to the, I want to say the highest purpose or the highest use, but the use for which that they're responsible for administering and maintaining. If that bridge falls down, everyone will have to go to 205 or down many miles to get across. There has been the insistence that there be fully developed infrastructure to support active transportation, walking, biking, and transit. Those are non-negotiables. They're happening. And not just a scary bike path on the side, but a full width of the bridge, access that's comfortable, and considerations for how to improve all of those access points on both sides. So the investment is there, and the push is there. So know that, especially from the Oregon perspective, there is a tremendous push to make sure that that is incorporated. But also have to think about Amazon, getting your things, Red Meyer, getting your food, whatever's coming off of those barges, getting that to where it needs to go. Measuring whether something is being used as an interstate or a local road. Again, that's a question that I have, because that should inform the width. If people are using it as a commuter path, then let's think about it now. If we're using it as an interstate, more people using it as an interstate, how do we make sure that we preserve what we need to preserve for the local residents, make it beautiful, make it usable, but also make sure that we're not hampering the ability for, frankly, commerce to move. We have to do that. And so that's a challenge, and it's one that's a philosophical one for many of the people who are working on the program. It's one that speaks to health outcomes. There's so many both direct and indirect consequences to any of the choices that are made. The challenge that I mentioned at the close of my conversation was, or my presentation was, it's as much a technical solution as it is a political one. And frankly, there are some pretty polar opinions going into what this should be. So the past year has not been, me walking around throwing daisies around. It's been, breaking up the fight from time to time because of the interests that people have and that strong advocacy. So I believe that, just as you mentioned, Rose Porter being a better project because of the way that the community came together and advocated, and many other projects across the country, that's happening even now. And it's happening at that ESG table. And part of why we're engaging the community advisory group, the equity advisory group, why we're having audiences with Lower Freeways just crossing the lines, why we're talking to the Sunshine group, the youth group that does climate change. All of those conversations are ones that we're having. And the options that I didn't talk about, like Frog Ferry and canoes and all the other things, how we can make that really a usable space in so many ways that we had not imagined before, because we're depending on the old way of doing things. Using it in its most natural form is the way that most folks would like to, in the way that's it's inobtrusive as possible. But that still allows for the business of business to be done. And that's a hard thing to deal with, but it is a thing. And unless we dismantle all of that, we have to figure out how, I mean, we can break it, but at what cost? And who is harmed? Again, who's harmed by us making some of the choices? So it has to be really balanced. So again, those places are important. Sure, I've talked well over my time.
No, this is amazing. Thank you so much. Let's get Millicent started.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sharing everything to us.
Yes, I was happy to do it. Always happy to share. I didn't have my information on the slide, but again, so you can share it if you're interested in shooting me an email, having coffee and talking about this or anything else for your students and your engineers or architects who want a job. Yeah, we can talk about that too. So yeah, it's really, not really, it's at OTAK.com, but I'd love to sit and chat more about all of it. Thank you so much. You're welcome. Yeah, bye. Okay, thanks. Bye. Thank you.
How's everyone doing? Yeah, her slides will be on our Google Drive. Yeah, I'll put it, I haven't put it up yet. So this actually wraps up the whole class in terms of our time together in class and the field trip and then the final presentation. So I was just gonna end the class as is. I was gonna open it up and let you guys interface with each other and talk about projects if you like. But I feel like I've been so honored to have been in this space to lead this class and bring in some of my friends and colleagues who've asked to come and speak for at the class and who I've reached out, say, hey, I'd love for you to come here, and all this other stuff.